I hit him so hard one time, right about the neck, and I heard him say, He was trying to win a boxing match. I was trying to kill that guy.
George Foreman's story is one of remarkable transformation. From a heavyweight champion who ruled the boxing ring to a beloved figure whose name is now synonymous with a revolutionary kitchen appliance, George's legacy extends far beyond the sport. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol of perseverance, redemption, and faith. Born into poverty and raised in the tough streets of Houston, George's rise to fame was anything but ordinary. He fought not only in the ring, but in life itself, overcoming personal struggles, setbacks, and losses. This is the story of a man who defied the odds, built a future for himself and his family, and left behind a legacy far richer than any title or fortune. Join us as we explore the life of a man who truly had the heart of a champion, both inside and outside the ring. George Foreman's story begins in the unforgiving streets of Houston's Fifth Ward, where survival was a daily struggle. Born into a broken home, he was the fifth of 7 children, raised by a mother who fought tirelessly to make ends meet. With no real father figure in his life, and his stepfather working long hours as a janitor, George faced immense challenges from an early age. Poverty, hunger, and the lack of basic necessities were constant companions. Shoes that didn't fit, clothes that were too worn, and nights spent wondering where the next meal would come from. These were the harsh realities of his childhood. But perhaps the greatest battle George faced wasn't external. It was within himself. Growing up in a neighborhood where violence and crime were everyday occurrences, George's anger became his shield. Bullied for his size and his circumstances, he fought to defend himself, developing a quick temper and a rebellious nature that often got him into trouble. The streets taught him that respect came through strength, and it was in this environment that George's path began to take shape. As a teenager, he found himself slipping further into a life of petty crime, stealing, fighting, and dreaming of escape. It wasn't just the streets that shaped George's destiny, but the overwhelming need to survive, to break free from the cycle of poverty and violence. His internal rage, once a means of survival, began to consume him, pushing him toward a dangerous future, until one fateful night, he had a life-changing realization. On the run from the police, George understood that if he didn't change, his life would be cut short. It was in this moment of desperation that he found his calling, a chance to escape his circumstances and find something greater than himself. The first step in his redemption began with that decision to join the Job Corps at just 16 years old. At the age of 16, George Foreman found himself standing at a crossroads. After years of struggling with anger, poor choices, and constant run-ins with the law, he knew something had to change or he would be lost forever. In a moment of clarity, he made the life-altering decision to join the Job Corps, a federal program designed to help troubled youth find direction. It was here, away from the streets of Houston, that George was given the opportunity to rebuild himself. It was also here that he met Doc Bruce, a mentor who would change the course of his life. Doc introduced George to boxing, recognizing something in him that few others did, a raw, untapped power. But boxing wasn't just about physical strength. It was about discipline, focus, and control, qualities George had never known but desperately needed. Under Doc's guidance, George's life began to transform. He traded his anger for purpose, his reckless energy for determination, and the streets for the gym. With each day of grueling training, George learned not just how to fight, but how to control his impulses, how to shape his body and mind into a weapon of discipline. The raw strength that had once been a source of destruction was now harnessed for something greater, a chance to escape his past and build a future. Boxing became more than just a sport. It became George's way out. And with every punch he threw, George wasn't just training his body, he was training his spirit, preparing himself for the journey ahead. As he grew stronger in the gym, George's newfound focus began to shine through. His transformation from a troubled, angry young man into a disciplined, motivated boxer was nothing short of remarkable. This was the beginning of George Foreman's real fight, the fight for his future and for the life he always dreamed of but never believed he could have. In 1968, George Foreman's journey took a monumental turn when he stepped onto the world stage at the Mexico City Olympics. This wasn't just another chance to prove himself in the ring, it was a chance to change the course of his life forever. After years of battling his own demons and fighting to survive, George found himself facing the ultimate test, to fight for the gold medal and show the world that a young man from the streets of Houston could rise above his circumstances. With raw aggression and an unrelenting drive, George dominated his opponents. His sheer power and determination made it clear that he wasn't just there to compete. He was there to win. Each punch was a statement, each round a step closer to redemption. The competition was fierce, but George fought with the fury of a man who had everything to prove and nothing to lose. When the final bell rang, it was George Foreman's hand that was raised in victory, and the gold medal around his neck was a symbol of his hard-fought transformation. The moment George stepped onto the podium, his heart swelled with pride, not just for himself, but for every forgotten child in the streets of his hometown. It was an overwhelming sense of personal triumph, a moment that proved to him and the world that he wasn't just a product of his environment. He was capable of greatness. The weight of the gold medal around his neck wasn't just about the honor of victory. It was proof that a boy who had once been lost in the darkness could rise to stand in the light, a champion in his own right. That moment on the podium wasn't just the culmination of a dream. It was the beginning of a new life for George Foreman. The world now saw him as a champion, but for George, it was more than just winning a medal. It was the moment he realized that he had the power to overcome anything and create a future far greater than he ever imagined. After his Olympic victory, George Foreman wasn't content to rest on his laurels. The gold medal had earned him global recognition, but it was his entry into the professional boxing world that would solidify his place in sports history. From the moment he stepped into the ring as a professional in 1969, Foreman's rise to dominance was nothing short of explosive. His brutal power and relentless aggression overwhelmed opponents, making him a force to be reckoned with in the heavyweight division. He wasn't just another boxer. He was a juggernaut, an unstoppable force that bulldozed anyone who dared stand in his way. Between 1969 and 1973, Foreman racked up an undefeated record, defeating one opponent after another with frightening efficiency. His punches were devastating, and his ability to wear down fighters with sheer strength was unmatched. Foreman didn't just win his matches, he annihilated his competition, often leaving spectators in awe of the destruction he wrought in the ring. Each fight was a display of raw power, a brutal symphony of jabs and hooks that left his opponents reeling, struggling to survive. One of the most defining moments of Foreman's early career came in 1973, when he faced off against the reigning heavyweight champion, Joe Frazier. Frazier, known for his toughness and relentless style, was considered unbeatable. But Foreman, with his explosive power and calm demeanor, was about to rewrite that narrative. In a fight that shocked the world, Foreman dismantled Frazier in just 2 rounds. 6 times, Frazier was knocked down. each time more brutal than the last. The world watched in disbelief as Foreman delivered one of the most dominant title wins in boxing history. In the span of a few short minutes, George Foreman had gone from a rising star to the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The victory over Frazier catapulted Foreman into a new level of fame. He was no longer just a boxer, he was a star, a larger-than-life figure in sports. With his new title came a whirlwind of opportunities. Endorsement deals flooded in, and companies clamored to associate their brands with Foreman's image. The man who had once struggled in the streets of Houston now found himself living in luxury. Flashy cars, lavish homes, and a life of excess became part of his new reality. His fame extended beyond boxing, and he became a household name, appearing on talk shows and in commercials, embodying the persona of the confident, undefeated champion. But with the fame and fortune came new challenges. Foreman, for all his success, wasn't at peace. His life had changed dramatically, but the emotional toll of being thrust into the spotlight weighed heavily on him. The loneliness that accompanied the fame began to creep in. Despite the wealth, the endorsement deals, and the adulation of fans, George often found himself questioning who truly cared for him. He had made it to the top, but the climb had come at a cost. Still, he continued to fight, driven by the ambition that had gotten him this far, and the promise that he would never go back to the life he had once known. The boxing world had yet to see anything like George Foreman. He wasn't just a heavyweight champion. He was a symbol of power and dominance. In the ring, he wasn't just fighting for titles. He was fighting for respect, for recognition, and for the future he had dreamed of since his days in the Job Corps. His rise from poverty to global stardom wasn't just a testament to his athleticism, it was a reflection of the tenacity and resilience that had been forged in the harsh streets of Houston. And as he stood in the ring, holding his championship belt high, Foreman knew that this was only the beginning of his extraordinary journey. In 1974, the world witnessed one of the most anticipated and talked about boxing matches in history, the Rumble in the Jungle. George Foreman, the undefeated heavyweight champion, faced Muhammad Ali in what would become a battle that transcended sports. Foreman, coming off a streak of destructive victories, entered the ring as the overwhelming favorite. His strength, his speed, and his unrelenting power had made him nearly untouchable, and the world expected nothing less than a brutal takedown of Ali. But in the humid night air of Kinshasa, Zaire, a different outcome was about to unfold, one that would shake Foreman to his core and change the course of his career forever. Muhammad Ali, known for his cunning intellect and ability to outthink his opponents, had a plan. A strategy that would soon become legendary, the rope-a-dope. Ali, who had been criticized for being past his prime, knew that the key to defeating Foreman wasn't strength, it was patience. Ali allowed Foreman to pour all his power into relentless punches, leaning back against the ropes, absorbing the punishment, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Foreman, who had built his entire career on overwhelming his opponents with power, fell right into Ali's trap. The fight turned into a grueling test of endurance. Foreman, used to dominating his opponents, found himself unable to break Ali's defenses. With every round, he grew more frustrated, more exhausted, and more out of control. Ali's strategy had worked. Foreman was burning himself out, throwing punches that weren't landing and wasting the precious energy he had. As the rounds dragged on, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Foreman, once the indomitable force, began to doubt himself. And in the 8th round, the moment of truth arrived. Ali, having weathered the storm, saw his opportunity. He struck Foreman with a powerful right hand, and in an instant, the champion who had once been invincible was down on the canvas. The knockout sent shockwaves through the boxing world. Foreman, who had been so sure of his superiority, had fallen, not because he wasn't strong, but because his power had been drained by Ali's brilliance. For Foreman, it wasn't just the loss of the title. It was the loss of something far more personal. His invincibility, the aura that had surrounded him, had been shattered in front of millions. The psychological impact of this defeat was profound. Foreman was left grappling with questions about his identity, his strength, and his place in the world. For years, he had been known as the unstoppable force, the monster in the ring. But now, he was just another man who had been outsmarted and overpowered. The emotional toll was immense. The loss wasn't just a blow to his career. It was a blow to his pride, to the very essence of who he was. George Foreman had always been defined by his power, but now, for the first time, he realized that strength wasn't enough to guarantee victory. He would have to come to terms with his vulnerability, something he had spent his entire life avoiding. The aftermath of the Rumble in the Jungle was a turning point for George Foreman, not just as a boxer, but as a person. The public saw a champion who had been knocked down, but what they didn't see was the man who was struggling to pick himself back up. This loss was a psychological battle that Foreman would carry with him for years. It wasn't just about getting back into the ring, it was about rediscovering who he was, both inside and outside of it. Foreman's defeat was more than just a moment in sports history. It was a moment of self-realization, one that would lead him down a path of personal reckoning and eventual redemption. But before that could happen, Foreman would have to face his own demons and rebuild himself from the inside out. After the crushing defeat to Muhammad Ali in 1974, George Foreman found himself in a spiral of personal and professional turmoil that seemed almost inevitable. The loss, which had shattered his previously unshakable confidence, was only the beginning of a dark period in his life. The man who had once been a force of nature in the ring now found himself grappling with a deep internal struggle. His identity, which had been so closely tied to his image as an invincible champion, was no longer certain. Foreman had built his entire career on the belief that strength was the answer to everything. But after Ali's victory, he realized that strength alone couldn't save him. The defeat sent George into a tumultuous period of anger and frustration. He couldn't accept that he had been outsmarted, that his power had been insufficient against Ali's mind. This anger, which had always been a part of him, began to consume him. In the ring, George's usual calm and composed demeanor was replaced with visible signs of agitation. He fought, but the fire wasn't the same. The victories didn't feel as sweet, and the losses felt heavier. The more he fought, the more he seemed to lose, not just in the ring, but in his personal life as well. As his frustration grew, so did the mood swings that plagued him. One moment, George could be full of energy, ready to take on the world, and the next, he'd fall into deep despondency. His mental and emotional state began to mirror the physical toll his body had endured in the ring. It was as if the weight of his previous victories, now overshadowed by his loss to Ali, had become too much for him to bear. Friends and family noticed the changes, his once calm demeanor now replaced by bursts of unpredictable emotion. This wasn't just a slump, it was a profound crisis that affected not only his boxing, but his very sense of self. By 1977, things had become even worse. After a shocking defeat to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico, Foreman's health and mental state reached a breaking point. Exhausted and dehydrated, he collapsed in the dressing room after the fight, the physical and emotional toll of his recent struggles finally catching up with him. It was in that moment, as he lay on the floor, that Foreman experienced something that would change the trajectory of his life. He described what happened next, not as a fainting spell, but as a near-death experience. He felt himself slipping away, sinking into darkness, before encountering visions of God, love, and forgiveness. It was during this moment of clarity, when death seemed so close, that George made a promise to himself and to a higher power. If he were given a second chance at life, he would dedicate it to something greater than fame, fortune, or boxing. He would dedicate it to faith. This experience, more than any loss or defeat in the ring, would mark the turning point in George Foreman's life. The man who had once fought with fury now found himself fighting a different kind of battle, a battle for his soul. The emotional scars from his loss to Ali, combined with the physical exhaustion from his boxing career, led George to a spiritual reckoning. He knew that he could no longer continue down the same path. His anger, his frustration, his inner turmoil, these had all been driving him toward a self-destructive end. But now, he had found a way out. A way to fight not with his fists, but with his faith. Foreman walked away from boxing, stepping into the world of ministry and dedicating himself to preaching the message of love, forgiveness, and redemption. Yet, even in his decision to retire, George's struggle wasn't over. The same man who had dominated in the ring with such intensity now had to find peace within himself. His journey of self-discovery had just begun, and it was a road that would be far more challenging than any fight he had ever faced in the ring. But it was also the road that would lead him to the ultimate redemption, not as a boxer, but as a man. In 1977, George Foreman's life took a turn that few could have predicted. After a devastating loss to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico, Foreman found himself at rock bottom. Exhausted, both physically and mentally, he collapsed in the dressing room. It wasn't just the defeat that had taken its toll. It was the years of pressure, the constant anger, and the weight of trying to maintain an image that was no longer sustainable. What happened next would reshape George's life in a way no one could have foreseen. As he lay there, on the verge of collapse, he experienced something far beyond the physical. It wasn't just a fainting spell. George described it as a near-death experience. He felt himself slipping away, sinking into a deep darkness. But then, in that moment of impending death, something profound happened. He saw visions of God, love, and forgiveness. For the first time in years, he felt peace. In that moment of clarity, George made a promise. If he survived, he would dedicate his life to something greater than fame, fortune, or boxing. He would turn to faith, a force that he had never fully embraced before. The realization hit him hard. His strength alone couldn't carry him any longer. It was time for a new kind of fight, one that didn't require fists, but faith. When George regained consciousness, he knew his life would never be the same. Without hesitation, he retired from boxing, leaving behind the sport that had defined him for so long. But retirement wasn't an escape into a life of comfort. Instead, it was a commitment to something much deeper. Foreman turned to ministry, dedicating himself to preaching and spreading a message of faith, love, and redemption. He opened the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ in Houston, where he began to minister to anyone who would listen. For the next decade, George Foreman's life took a very different turn. Gone were the days of fame and fortune. In their place was a life of humility, service, and spiritual growth. Yet, the path was not easy. Despite the sincerity of his faith, George faced challenges. His ministry was modest, and there were times when he struggled financially, unable to generate the support he needed. Foreman, once a multi-millionaire boxing champion, now lived more modestly, preaching to small congregations and striving to help those in need. He worked with the homeless, gave food to the hungry, and became deeply involved in his community. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but George was determined to follow the promise he had made. The man who had once been defined by his physical power was now finding strength in something far greater than anything he had ever known: his faith. Despite his struggles, Foreman never complained. He didn't seek attention or recognition. He simply followed the path he believed he was meant to take. His time away from the public eye was marked by quiet dedication to his ministry and to the people he served. While his boxing career had been built on power and dominance, his life as a preacher was rooted in humility and service. But even as he gave so much of himself to others, George never lost sight of the fact that his personal redemption was just as important as his work in the community. He had found a new purpose, one that gave him peace and fulfillment, a stark contrast to the inner turmoil he had experienced before. In this new chapter, George Foreman became more than just a former champion. He became a man who had rediscovered his true self, a man who had fought battles inside and outside the ring, and who had ultimately found redemption through faith. It was this journey of transformation that would lead George back to the world he once dominated, but not as the same man. Now, he was a man who had fought his greatest fight and emerged victorious, not in the ring, but in life itself. In 1987, at the age of 38, George Foreman made a decision that shocked the world. He was coming back to boxing. After a decade of retirement, a life dedicated to faith and ministry, George's return to the sport seemed unlikely at best and absurd at worst. His body, once a finely tuned machine of power and speed, was now carrying an extra 40 pounds. His punches, which had once rattled the ring, were slower, and his stamina was far from what it used to be. Many in the boxing world laughed at the idea of Foreman returning. How could a man nearing 40, who had spent over a decade out of the ring, expect to compete at the highest level again? The mockery was relentless. Critics doubted his ability to even land a punch, let alone win fights. Foreman wasn't just up against opponents in the ring, he was up against the disbelief of the entire boxing world. But Foreman wasn't concerned with their doubts. He wasn't returning for glory, fame, or revenge. He was fighting for something far more personal: his family's future. His financial struggles from his previous life had taken their toll, and George was determined to build something stable for his children and loved ones. Boxing, once the source of his success, was now his means of survival. It was a testament to his resilience, his belief in himself, and the unrelenting spirit that had defined his life. It wasn't just a win for George. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been told they were too old, too broken, or too far gone to succeed. In the aftermath, as the crowd erupted and the cameras flashed, George Foreman knelt in the center of the ring, his hands raised in prayer. It was a quiet moment of reflection for a man who had already conquered so much. George wasn't just celebrating the belt. He was honoring the journey that had brought him here. The years of struggle, the battles with his own demons, and the relentless pursuit of redemption. In his later years, George found peace on his ranch in Texas, where he spent quiet moments with his family. Away from the spotlight, he embraced a simpler life, filled with the things that truly mattered: faith, family, and reflection. His time at the ranch was a period of calm after a lifetime of battles, both in and out of the ring. It was here, in the serenity of the countryside, that George could reflect on the incredible journey he had taken, from the streets of Houston to the pinnacle of boxing, and finally, to a place of spiritual peace and fulfillment. As he prepared for the inevitable, George knew that his time was running out, but he was at peace. Surrounded by his loved ones, he could look back on a life well lived, knowing that he had fought his greatest battles, not just with his fists, but with his heart. His family, the legacy of his faith, and the love he had poured into his children were the true measure of his success. It wasn't the titles, the championships, or the grills. It was the relationships he had built and the wisdom he had passed down that would stand the test of time. As the years rolled on, George's final days were spent in the comfort of his family's love and the peace he had found through faith. George Foreman may have left this world, but his legacy, built on faith, family, and the courage to reinvent oneself, would continue to shape the lives of those who loved him. The lessons he imparted, the values he upheld, and the love he shared would live on in his children, his grandchildren, and the countless lives he had touched. His final goodbye wasn't just an end. It was a lasting testament to a life well lived. George Foreman's legacy goes far beyond his wealth, fame, and boxing titles. As we reflect on his life, we are reminded that no matter the obstacles, it's never too late to start anew, to find redemption, and to make a lasting impact on those we love. George Foreman's final greatest gift was not the wealth he amassed, but the example he set for us all, a life lived with purpose, heart, and unshakable faith.